Welcome back, and thank you for coming back. We're always surprised that you
shocked.
would give up some time to be with us. Steve Autrey, and yes, whether you want to hear it or not, I am still the pastor at Denver United Methodist Church, and this is the very Reverend Paul B. Thompson of Huntersville United Methodist Church. And again, we do appreciate you giving us some of your time.
Can you imagine what our high school buddies, if they were to watch this, what they'd be saying? Be like, anyway.
Yeah, well, there is that. Just anybody's like that. Those guys are pastors, and they let them have a forum. People listen to them talk.
Yeah.
So we're going to try to give you a reason to listen, as we want to continue our conversation. Primarily, we are working. Today's conversation is going to be a little bit about the church, and to bridge to that, we are in this study on Matthew. Matthew is an interesting gospel in that it's the only gospel that actually uses the word that we translate as church. Mm-hmm. We have to remember that when these gospels are being written down and when Jesus is walking the earth, there is no, we're used to the Bible being from Genesis to Revelation. Well, you didn't have anything after the end of the Old Testament.
So we're guessing, of course nobody knows for sure, but Paul's letters are probably written between, say, 40 and 60, or maybe a little past that, but during that
give
period.
Give or take a little, right.
And then probably Mark's gospel is the first of the gospels to be written down, probably in conjunction with the Roman Jewish War of 68 to 70 A.D., and then it's likely, after Mark, then both Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source for the writing of their gospels. Whole sections of Mark are verbatim in Matthew and Luke, so that's why we think that.
Right, and it's also part of why we know Matthew's a little later, because he actually uses the term church, and that we see the development of worshiping communities. So that worshiping community, though, the seeds for that are sown in the ministry of Jesus. And in those who follow Jesus, the earliest followers of Jesus were not known as Christians at all. They were
the people of the way.
And that way was Jesus.
Yeah.
Now, as things develop in the first century, you begin to have small group gatherings of disciples. You begin to have the spread of Christianity. Paul has as much to do that, not you. I don't know what you've ever done. But St. Paul, don't mistake St. Paul
People
with this
often
Paul.
Call me St. Paul, I think.
I think they do. That's not what they're saying, but you hear what you want to hear. So the church is beginning to grow, and I know and believe this is part of Jesus's vision all along, is to develop a group of followers who will take on his work and his ministry to the ends of the earth. And that eventually develops into what we know as the church.
Yeah, because the church really never intended to separate from the synagogue, from the Jewish tradition. It was for them first. We Gentiles were kind of grafted into this vine, it's called, or grafted into this bush. And so
adopted into the family.
But as the church, eventually the synagogue put in curses by the end of the first century, that if you claimed Jesus as Lord, if you claimed him as Christ, then you were cast out of the synagogue. Yeah. So by the end of the first century, there was delineation between the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition.
Right. It was its own thing. Mm-hmm. And we could, there's so much to church history. The different movements, the different expressions, the way it goes from being this very almost non-entity to really changing all of the world. And what we know of as church today, there are so many different expressions of church. As you know, when you go to Huntersville United Methodist Church or you come to Denver, you probably drive by any number of churches and denominations. And they all have a little bit different take on most churches, and this is something a professor of mine pointed out in seminary, was that when you get right down to it, most Christian churches agree on about 90% of the things, right? And then we spend all of our time fighting about the things we don't agree on.
So the early church had its share of battles. The early church battled over circumcision. The early church battled over what of the food laws to keep. the early church battled over, what is the connection of the Jewish law to this newfound Christian faith?
Right. And they argued about who's in and who's out. And a lot of the book of Acts details those struggles to respond to the Holy Spirit in a faithful way. And they had to honestly ask themselves, well, God, what are you doing? Because some of them had different thoughts on what should be next. And they also operated under the I would say the mindset that Jesus was going to return any moment.
Mm-hmm. And so what we find is the church has always struggled over various issues. The issues change over time, but there's always been a struggle.
And chances are, if you're listening to this today, you have I like to use big words, a variegated church experience. It means you got at least one different strand in there somewhere.
Yeah.
And in my experience of being a Methodist minister, lots of people come to Methodist churches from all kinds of backgrounds. Oddly enough, I've noticed if there were two different traditions that show up to become United Methodist, it's oddly enough lots of people used to be Catholic, mm-hmm. and lots of people used to be some type of Baptist denomination.
I would say that's true for Huntersville. I've looked around and kind of done a anecdotal type survey, and I would say at least 25% of the people in our church grew up in the Catholic tradition.
Well, you have to know we're both mutts. We both grew up in. I grew up in a Southern Baptist tradition.
We were Southern Baptists as well.
And our idea of being Southern Baptist in the church I grew up in is that we took up the Lottie Moon offering and sent a messenger to however they did things. But
Southern Baptist Convention.
Right, and we used the Sunday school material. But, it was and those of you who are from that tradition know that's a loose way to connect churches. It's not a real formal structure. The individual church in that case set the guidelines and parameters around what they taught and what they believed.
So what's fascinating about growing up Baptist is every church was kind of allowed to be its own, have its own thoughts about things. That was one of the great things about being Baptist. Nobody could tell you what to think or believe, and so every church had its own way.
And one of the hard things about being Baptist was that every church kind of had its own way of being.
Yeah.
And it at least in the context I grew up in, it instilled a bit of competition. We didn't do a lot with any other churches. We kept to ourselves.
So there's a church, I don't know if you read about it, in Jacksonville that distributed a statement on behalf of the church that if you were a member of that church, you were going to have to sign that to continue to be a member.
So it was a doctrinal statement.
Doctrinal statement on sexuality. And they've had, of course, some pushback and feedback about that, and people who don't belong to the church, and they've had some forums. It's just fascinating to me in a church like that. This is what we want you to sign this, that you believe this. This is who we are.
And church, so many people do things so differently. I know I've heard there are a few churches that require their members to submit their W-2 forms, and why? Well, so that they make sure you're paying your tithe. And that's just a statement of fact. It's, and some people like that type of church, and it works for some people. Others are like, there's no way I would go to a church like that. And it's interesting how most churches agree on the creedal aspects that we understand of God the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. We understand in the divinity of Jesus, belief in the resurrection, and the work of the Holy Spirit. But then we end up diverging in lots of ways. And I don't know if that's ever what Jesus really intended. It's kind of part of our human experience that we tend to break off into people who think like us. And that, again, that's just part of the human experience. And I know we've kind of gone far afield here, but all of this comes back around to the United Methodist Church has its own challenges. And if you're watching this, my guess is you're plugged in and engaged with what your church is doing.
Yeah, maybe we can spend a couple of minutes tomorrow on tomorrow's podcast, actually, diving in a little deeper on that.
I think that would be helpful. And believe me, this is in the context of Matthew, because Matthew is the the Sermon on the Mount that we're getting ready to enter into, it is the primary way we are called to be in this world. And it's basically the constitution for the church.
Yeah,
and
what
so
it boils down to is conversation around law and grace, church and belief.
Right. So tomorrow we'll take a little time just to discuss our different context, what it means to us to be United Methodist, and what maybe even some of our hopes for the future.
Yeah. Well, we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
You.
Thanks.